Okay, there were two big news stories going on yesterday as I could see it. One of them, of course, was the coup d'etat in Sudan, which I covered, and the fall of Omar al-Bashir. That's going to be an interesting situation to watch how that plays out. The other one, of course, was the arrest of Julian Assange. So I just want to comment a bit on this and my take on it. Um, so Assange was basically dragged out of the Ecuadorian Embassy. He was bearded. He looked he looked quite dishevelled and defiant as always. Theresa May welcomed the decision, as no doubt the U.S. State Department will do, and the Trump administration. I'd be surprised if he's not extradited to the United States. Um, his lawyers, of course, have said that this is a travesty, and his supporters see him as a brave crusader for transparency and freedom. Okay, my stance on Assange is honestly to the more skeptical side, and I'm going to lay out the reasons why. He's been in the Ecuadorian embassy now since 2012. Um, at that time, under the permission, the grace, whatever you want to call it, of President Rafael Correa. President Correa has done interviews today in which he said that it's not a case that the Ecuadorian government exactly agreed with Assange's views, but it's a basic human right. Nevertheless, why would Ecuador choose to do that? You know, it's a question that one has to consider. Why Ecuador? Why uh, a relatively small South American country? Why would they choose to take in someone like Julian Assange? Could it be that Mr. Assange's worldview is conveniently similar to Rafael Carrera's left wing worldview? That's a question. And this really comes to an issue around Julian Assange personally. Now, WikiLeaks, the whole thing about WikiLeaks was about transparency. And when it started really getting public attention around 2010, Julian Assange done a now famous interview with Atika Schubert on CNN. That was a rather testy interview because she brought up questions about his personal relationship with other employees of WikiLeaks. He didn't quite storm out, as CNN said, but it was definitely a testy interview. And clearly, Julian Assange didn't like the questions about his own person and questions being directed at him. So this is a man that talks about transparency, but whenever the transparency comes in his direction, it's a different matter. So to his supporters, Assange is a brave warrior of freedom, a brave investigative journalist who's exposing big power. To his critics, he's little more than a glorified hack who has thrown around information recklessly and who is guided by egoism and by his own narcissistic agenda. I have to be honest, I veer more to the latter. And this is why there's a few questions I have about Julian Assange. Firstly, let's take the rape allegations in 2012 now, which is why he sought refuge in the embassy. He skipped bail on that occasion. Now, Assange and his defenders said that it was all a smear campaign by the Americans to try and get into the United States or to, have a character assassination. I don't know if he's guilty or not. I have absolutely no idea. It may be that it was a smear campaign. But here's my question. If he was an innocent man, why not just face accountability? Why not go to the trial in Sweden? I mean, Sweden is a country that has not got a reputation for a corrupt legal system. You know, if he's going to get a fair trial anywhere, it's likely to be in Sweden. So I think he should have just, answered to those allegations. Um, and if he's innocent, then he could have had good defense lawyers who would have shown that he was innocent, and the credibility of his accusers would have been brought into question. But he didn't even show up to that. He skipped bail. Now, to me, an innocent man doesn't do that. It definitely raises some credibility questions. Um, and if he was innocent, then the Swedes wouldn't have extradited him. I don't think it's a case that they would have just handed him over to the Americans, as he and his supporters argue. I don't think that would have happened. There have been several examples actually where the Nordic states have been at loggerheads with the United States, not over this case obviously, but over other situations. So that to me raises a few questions. Based on the interviews he's done, based on the sort of things he said, I do think he's quite narcissistic and arrogant. Um, I mean, he says it's not about me, but WikiLeaks has kind of become the Julian Assange show. Now, WikiLeaks itself, is it an ethical organization? Is it an important organization? On the surface, people would say yes. Well, of course, it exposes big government cover ups, it exposes surveillance, it exposes dodgy foreign wars. Um, but here's a question: is there really a public need to know every single nuance of intelligence or foreign policy or military operations? I would say no. That I need to know as a citizen every single detail, for example, of a counter-terrorist operation against a jihadist cell. No. What I want to know is, are the people being targeted definitely guilty? And was the operation successful? I don't need to know the exact location of officers involved in that. I don't need to know exactly every detail. I think there is a valid argument to be made that WikiLeaks actually serves as useful fodder for terrorists and for those powerful bodies around the world to have an anti West agenda. I mean, if it's all about exposing big government power, why does it seem to be solely directed at the West? What about Russia? What about China? And it's true there are dissidents in those countries who sort of want their own version of WikiLeaks. But Julian Assange does seem to be guided by his personal animosity towards American foreign policy. And he's not the only one. There are investigative journalists like Robert Fisk and John Pilger, who, in my view, they're experienced journalists, no question about it, but they've sort of paradoxically become useful tools. I'm not going to say useful idiots. I don't think they're idiots. I think they're smart guys, but they've become useful tools for the likes of the Kremlin. And they, of course, would robustly deny that. But take Robert Fisk, for example. He seems to relish and desire Western military failure in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan because that would be convenient for his worldview, which is very left wing. I mean, look at the way Fisk writes about the British government. He talks sarcastically about our masters, knowing damn well that it is far easier to criticise the British government as a British, or in his case, Australian citizen, than it is, if you were a dissident in a country like Russia. I mean, look how many Russian journalists have mysteriously ended up dead, and they've been Putin critics. And no, I'm not saying that Pilger and Fisk are apologists for left wing dictatorships or regimes that are hostile to the West. Not necessarily. They have criticized them. But I feel that there are a lot of people who present themselves as investigative journalists who are actually more guided by their ideology than by actually the whole truth. And that's not to say that what they report isn't true. But let me offer another example. Eva Bartlett, the the same Eva Bartlett who RT stooges like to hail as a brave investigative journalist. But who is she really? She's a Canadian national who has served as nothing more than an apologist for a vicious, murdering, bloody dictatorship that gasses children. I feel Eva Bartlett is a very, very immoral character. I think she is a shameless woman who has served as a useful cheerleader for a very evil man. There's nothing noble or brave about what she does. And yet, if you look at the likes of RT, I mean, she says she's an independent journalist. How? I mean, that's just an oxymoron. How can you be independent if you are on record as supporting one warring party over another? It just it is against the very definition of it, and only the most blowhard, mindless sheep who follows RT would really believe that she is an independent journalist. She's not. Now, supporters of Julian Assange, who say that he's a brave crusader for accountability and transparency, I mean, has Julian Assange ever questioned the Russian government, the Chinese government? Why is all his criticism directed at Washington and London? I think these are valid questions. Why is it that RT handled this case as holding up Assange to be a brave investigative journalist? I mean, if he was against all corridors of power, wouldn't RT be just as suspicious of him as Western authorities are? Because they would say, oh, he's scrutinizing Russia as well, but they don't do that because he doesn't. Why is it that organizations, human rights organizations like Amnesty International and others, if Julian Assange, if there was really a case that Julian Assange's human rights were being violated, wouldn't they be all over this and condemning Washington and London? Well, I looked at their Facebook page; they haven't even mentioned it, which I find interesting. And another thing, one of the reasons the current Ecuadorian administration have kind of let him go is they've argued that he's been very rude and unreasonable towards staff at the embassy. Now, that at the very least is not practical. If you're going to be housed by an embassy, don't be rude to the people who are protecting you. That just doesn't make any sense. And that again ties into Assange's reputed narcissism. I mean, I think the guy has a sort of entitlement mentality. So yeah, I'm biased on this. I don't trust Julian Assange. As simple as that. I do think there is a place for whistleblowers. I do think there's a place for investigative journalism. Is there corruption in the corridors of power in Washington and London? Absolutely. I'm sure there is. I mean, if we didn't have investigative journalism, then Watergate and the phone hacking scandal would never have been exposed. So I do think there is a place for investigative journalism. I just think that people are holding up Julian Assange to be something that he's not. I do feel that he's little more than a glorified hack who basically has his own agenda, which is basically to sabotage Western foreign policy. I think that's his agenda. I mean, do the public really need to know every single nuance, for example, of troop movements or what intelligence officers are doing? I mean, that defeats the whole point of intelligence. Even Rafael Correa himself said that every country has a right to a certain amount of state secrets to intelligence. Otherwise, the whole notion of nation states goes down the drain. I mean, if all intelligence is just in the public domain, then spies, well, there would be no espionage, but there would, which I guess would be a good thing, but it would mean that terrorists could do what they want with impunity. It would mean that we would live in an absolutely lawless world. It would mean that there is absolutely no red lines whatsoever on what organized criminals and terrorists can do. And I suspect that at its worst, Wikileaks is basically providing material to some very dangerous and immoral people. And that's where ethical questions actually become more complex. Is WikiLeaks really a noble organization that is exposing corruption in the CIA in Washington and London? Or is it a reckless organization that is actually potentially putting lives in jeopardy, i.e., the lives of intelligence officers or the lives of soldiers? Um, so, there's always going to be people that are absolutely convinced that the evil, wicked Western governments are, they can't be trusted, and Assange is a brave guy who's just out to expose them. I don't think it's that simple. Leave it there.